Please, just act like you know me. Don't look back. Just walk me home." Naomi froze, her hand trembling as she gripped the sleeve of a tailored cream suit she could never afford, standing in a rain-slicked alley she was never meant to be trapped in. She had only wanted to finish her double shift, shed her green cleaning apron and make it back to her apartment safely, but a few heavy footsteps behind her changed everything. The district was nearly deserted, neon signs flickering against the damp pavement, and she had been told this route was the quickest way to the station at midnight, told that if she kept her head down, she'd be invisible. Nothing prepared her for the three shadows closing in with predatory intent, the cold realization that she was being hunted, or the panic that tightened around her throat like a wire. So before she could be cornered, she lunged toward the only person in sight. Then she saw him, Yoon Tae-Kyung, calm, polished, lethal, the White Dragon Mafia boss who ruled the city's underworld with a silent iron grip. To him, she looked like a desperate gamble, wrong district, wrong stranger, a maid clinging to the arm of a man who dealt in blood. When he tilted his head, his narrowed eyes studying her wide-eyed terror while the ink of a dragon tattoo peeked from his collar, he measured her risk in a single heartbeat, then made a decision that would shatter her quiet life forever. Because instead of shaking her off, he leaned into her space and claimed her, dragging her from the world of service into a storm of violence, obsession, and a dark protection she might never want to leave. Tae-Kyung didn't move. He remained leaned against the cool metal of his car, the glowing tip of his cigarette the only light in the shadow cast by his frame. He felt the frantic, fluttering pressure of her fingers on his sleeve, small, calloused from labor, and vibrating with a terror so pure it was almost tangible. He looked down at the woman standing in his personal space. Her deep brown skin was slicked with rain, and her eyes, wide and luminous with controlled panic, searched his face with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. She had no idea. She didn't recognize the stylized dragon ink curling up his neck or the way the street seemed to go silent the moment he stepped into it. To her, he was just a man in a clean suit, a lucky break in a dark alley. The irony was almost enough to make him laugh, though his expression remained a mask of polished, as neutral stone. Behind her, the three shadows slowed their pace, hovering at the edge of the neon light, hesitating. They knew exactly who he was. They were looking at the White Dragon, and they were currently calculating whether their lives were worth whatever prize she represented. "Please," she whispered again, her breath hitching. "Just a few blocks. I'm Naomi. I work at the center. I just want to go home." Tae-Kyung felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine curiosity. Usually, people looked at him and saw a monster, a god, or a target. This woman saw a boyfriend. She saw a savior. He studied the way she held her ground even as her knees threatened to buckle, her chin lifted in a defiance that didn't match her trembling hands. She was a service worker, a maid by the look of her neat white polo and the green apron peeking out from her bag. Yet she was playing a high-stakes game with a man who could end her with a nod. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke into the space between them. "Naomi," he repeated, the name tasting strange on his tongue. He straightened his posture, towering over her, and watched her eyes flicker to the sharp line of his jaw. "You're asking for a lot of protection for a stranger." "I have nothing else to ask," she said, her voice cracking. He glanced past her at the men in the shadows. He saw the glint of a blade being tucked away and the frantic retreat as they realized he wasn't going to push her away. He could have ended it there. He could have told her to get lost and watched the shadows swallow her whole. But the way her pulse was visible against her neck, the pure, raw honesty of it, fascinated him. "The center," he mused, reaching out. His fingers, cold and steady, brushed a stray, wet curl from her forehead. Naomi flinched but didn't pull back, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. "I hope you're a fast walker, Naomi, because I don't like to repeat myself, and I certainly don't like to be kept waiting." He stepped closer, invading her space until she was boxed between his body and the car. He could smell the cheap lavender soap on her skin and the ozone of the storm. "I'll walk you," he murmured, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous thread. "But remember this. Once you invite a man like me into your life, the street dogs are the least of your worries." The rhythmic click of Naomi's worn work shoes against the pavement was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the alley. Beside her, Tae-Kyung moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of his cream suit jacket. To any onlooker, they were a couple, a wealthy man and a working-class woman, but Naomi could feel the heat radiating from his frame, a reminder that she was walking beside a live wire. "Don't look back," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the hum of distant traffic. Naomi swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the flickering neon sign of a closed convenience store ahead. "Are they still there?" "They never left," Tae-Kyung replied. He didn't sound worried, he sounded bored. "But they've stopped trying to look like amateurs. Street thugs don't follow a man in a six-figure suit for 3 blocks unless they're looking for a casket." The air shifted. The humidity of the Seoul night seemed to thicken, and the hair on the back of Naomi's neck stood up. From the darkness of a recessed doorway behind them came the faint, metallic hiss of a suppressed slide. It was a sound Naomi didn't recognize, but Tae-Kyung reacted before the first round could even leave the barrel. In one seamless motion, his arm hooked around Naomi's waist, hoisting her off her feet and swinging her behind the solid iron pillar of an old storefront. The transition was so violent and fast it stole the breath from her lungs. She hit the brick wall with a gasp, her eyes wide as she saw Tae-Kyung pivot back into the open. He didn't pull a gun. Instead, he reached into his jacket and flicked his wrist. A slender, silver blade appeared in his hand like a magic trick. 2 men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by black masks. They held pistols equipped with long, cylindrical silencers, the tools of professional assassins, not neighborhood bullies. The first man fired. A soft thwip echoed through the alley, and a spark flew off the pavement where Tae-Kyung had been standing a millisecond prior. Tae-Kyung was a blur of cream silk and lethal intent. He closed the distance before the shooter could realign his sights. Naomi watched, frozen in a state of controlled panic, as Tae-Kyung stepped inside the man's guard, his blade catching the neon light in a lethal arc. A muffled grunt, a flash of silver, and the first assassin collapsed, clutching a throat that was suddenly spraying crimson onto the damp concrete. The second man panicked, his suppressed pistol spitting 3 rapid rounds into the air. Tae-Kyung didn't flinch. He used the falling body of the first man as a shield, then launched himself forward. He caught the shooter's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing clearly in the narrow space. The gun clattered to the ground, and before the man could scream, Tae-Kyung's knee found his chest, followed by a final surgical strike with the butt of the knife to the temple. The alley fell silent again, save for the heavy thud of the second body hitting the ground. Tae-Kyung stood over them, his breathing remarkably steady, his suit still pristine despite the carnage at his feet. He wiped the silver blade on the sleeve of the fallen man and tucked it away. When he turned back to Naomi, the narrow intensity in his eyes hadn't faded. "You said you were a maid, Naomi," he said, walking toward her as she pressed herself deeper into the bricks. "Tell me, why is a syndicate hit squad following a woman who scrubs floors?" Naomi stared at the cooling bodies on the pavement, the metallic tang of blood cutting through the scent of rain. Her knees finally gave out, but before she could hit the concrete, Tae-Kyung's hand clamped around her upper arm. His grip wasn't a caress. It was a shackle. I need to go home," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "My apartment is just 3 blocks away. I can lock the door. I can call the police." Tae-Kyung let out a short, mirthless sound that might have been a laugh. He didn't look at her. He was scanning the rooftops, his eyes narrowed and alert. "Police?" he echoed, his voice dropping into that terrifying, silky register. "The men I just killed were wearing tactical gear and carrying suppressed high-end hardware. They aren't street thugs looking for a wallet, Naomi. They are hunters, and they don't stop until they bring back a head." He began pulling her toward the luxury car, his stride long and uncompromising. Naomi stumbled, her green apron snagging on the door handle as he shoved her into the leather-scented interior of the passenger seat. "Wait! This isn't the way to my street!" she cried out as the engine roared to life, a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Tae-Kyung didn't answer until they had cleared the narrow alley, the car weaving through the neon-lit maze of the district with surgical precision. He drove with one hand, with the other resting casually on the gear shift, though the knuckles were still dusted with the ghost of a violent encounter. "You don't have a home anymore," he said flatly. "The moment you grabbed my arm, you stepped out of your world and into mine. If you go back to that apartment, you won't last 10 minutes. They'll be waiting in the stairwell. They'll be sitting in your kitchen. They'll peel the truth out of you before they bury you in the floorboards." Naomi pressed her back against the seat, her hands clutched in her lap. "I don't have any truth. I'm just a maid. I scrub floors." "Then you saw something while you were scrubbing," Tae-Kyung countered, his eyes catching the passing flicker of a red light. "The Iron Fang Syndicate doesn't waste professional hit squads on nobodies unless those nobodies have become a threat." The car ascended a private ramp, the city of Seoul falling away beneath them as they climbed toward the summit of a black glass skyscraper, the Obsidian Tower. The elevator was a silent, high-speed ascent that made Naomi's ears pop. When the doors slid open, she gasped. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of cold marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and minimalist luxury that felt more like a fortress than a home. The city lights stretched out like a carpet of diamonds below, but Naomi felt no wonder, only a crushing sense of being trapped. Tae-Kyung stepped into the center of the room, shedding his cream suit jacket to reveal the black dragon tattoo snaking down his neck and disappearing beneath his shirt. He turned to face her, his silhouette framed by the midnight sky. "Listen to me carefully, little bird," he murmured, stepping into her personal space until the scent of his expensive cologne and cold rain overwhelmed her. "As far as the world is concerned, you are already dead. You died the second those men saw you with me. If you walk out that door, you're a ghost walking toward a grave. You stay here, under my shadow, or you perish. There is no middle ground." Naomi stood paralyzed in the center of the vast, cold marble floor, her shadow stretching long and thin under the sharp LED recessed lighting. The silence of the penthouse was heavier than the gunfire in the alleyway. It was a silence that felt expensive, curated, and utterly lethal. She watched Tae-Kyung as he turned his back to her, his movements methodical as he poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. As he tilted his head to drain the glass, the light caught the side of his neck with unforgiving clarity. Naomi's breath hitched. From her distance, it had looked like a mere shadow or a smudge of grime from the fight. But here, in the clinical brightness of his sanctuary, the truth was undeniable. A stylized dragon, inked in deep midnight black, coiled around his jugular, its tail disappearing beneath the collar of his white dress shirt, and its head resting just beneath his ear. It wasn't just a tattoo, it was a brand. She had seen that specific design on the news, whispered about in the kitchens where she worked, and etched into the warnings her mother had given her about the streets of Seoul. This was the mark of the White Dragon, the man who owned the shadows the police were too afraid to enter. "You're looking at the ink," he said, his voice cutting through the air without him even turning around. Naomi took a trembling step backward, her heel clicking sharply against the marble. The sound felt like a gunshot in the quiet room. I thought you were just a businessman. Someone with a car. Someone who could help." Tae-Kyung turned slowly, the glass still in his hand. The polished elite mask he had worn in the street was beginning to slip, revealing the predator beneath. He didn't look like a gentleman anymore. He looked like a king standing over a stray that had wandered into his court. "I am a businessman, Naomi. It just so happens that my business requires a certain level of finality," he murmured, stepping toward her. Naomi felt the familiar wall of her controlled panic rising, but this time, There was nowhere to run. She was thousands of feet above the ground, locked behind biometric glass and steel. She realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't escaped the danger in the alley. She had simply traded 3 small monsters for the one that ruled them all. She had walked herself directly into a cage, and the bars were made of gold and blood. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice cracking as he stopped just inches from her, invading her space with the scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch. "I'm a maid. I'm nobody." Tae-Kyung reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying tenderness. His skin was cold, his touch possessive. He leaned down, his lips ghosting against her ear as he spoke in a silken thread of a voice. "Nobody is a nobody in this city, little bird. You saw something today that was worth a hit squad, and now you belong to the only man who can keep them from taking what's inside that head of yours." He pulled back just enough to look into her wide, terrified eyes. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. "You're not a maid tonight. You're my guest. And in this house, the only thing more dangerous than the men outside is me." Tae-Kyung stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the distant glow of soul reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. He didn't turn around when Naomi finally spoke, her voice small and trembling against the vastness of the penthouse. "I don't understand," she whispered, her fingers twisting the hem of her white polo. "I'm just a cleaner. I work at the Grand Meridian. I mop floors. I empty bins. I stay out of the way. Why would people like that? People with silencers want me?" Tae-Kyung turned slowly, his gaze dropping to the green apron still clutched in her hand like a security blanket. "The Grand Meridian," he repeated, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "Room 404. You cleaned it this afternoon, didn't you?" Naomi's heart stuttered. "How do you know that?" "Because that room was used for a private exchange between the Iron Fang Syndicate and a high-level defector," Tae-Kyung said, stepping toward her with predatory slowness. "It was supposed to be a clean meet. No records, no traces. But the defector grew a conscience and tried to run. Things got messy. There was blood on the white shag carpet, Naomi. Blood that was scrubbed away before the police could ever be notified." Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. As she remembered the room, it had been a disaster. Shattered glass, a copper-smelling stain near the balcony, and a small encrypted drive she had found tucked behind a decorative pillow. She had thought it was just another guest's forgotten trash. She had wiped the stains, tossed the trash, and moved on to the next floor, oblivious to the fact that she was erasing the evidence of a massacre. I just cleaned it," she breathed, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "I didn't see any people, I didn't hear anything." "It doesn't matter what you saw," Tae-Kyung countered, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "In their world, witnesses aren't defined by what they know, but by what they might know. To the Iron Fang boss, you are a loose thread. You touched the blood. You handled the room where a $30 million secret went missing. They don't want to ask you questions, Naomi. They want to ensure you never have the chance to answer any." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The street dogs hadn't been random thugs. They were a cleanup crew sent to finish the job she had unknowingly interrupted with her mop and bucket. She looked up at Tae-Kyung, at the dragon coiled around his neck, and realized that her life, the quiet, hard-working life she had built, was officially a casualty of a war she didn't understand. "They think I have it," she whispered, the panic finally breaking through her voice. "The thing they were fighting over. They think I took it." Tae-Kyung reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before his fingers settled firmly on her shoulder. The weight was heavy, and possessive, and terrifyingly steady. "They don't just think it, Naomi. They're certain of it. And right now, the only reason you aren't at the bottom of the Han River is because I decided your life was worth more than their silence." He leaned down, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, burning intensity. "You didn't just walk home with a stranger tonight. You walked into the middle of a war, and from this moment on, you belong to the dragon." The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken only by the soft chime of the elevator. 2 men in identical black suits entered, carrying garment bags and velvet boxes with the clinical efficiency of soldiers. Tae-Kyung didn't look up from the tablet he was scrolling through. He simply gestured toward the master suite where Naomi stood, still clad in her damp, stained maid's uniform. "Take off the apron, Naomi," Tae-Kyung commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum that brooked no argument. "The woman who cleaned room 404 is dead. From this moment on, you are the only thing in this city that the Iron Fang cannot touch." Naomi looked at the green fabric of her apron, the symbol of her invisibility, her struggle, and her safety. To shed it felt like shedding her skin. But as she retreated into the suite, she found the bed covered in moonlight and silk. The garments were a deep, midnight blue, crafted from fabric so fine it felt like liquid against her fingertips. Beside them lay a necklace of raw diamonds, stones that didn't just sparkle but seemed to bite at the light. When she finally emerged, the change was visceral. The high puff of her natural hair had been tamed into a sleek, elegant crown, and the silk dress clung to her curves, transforming her boxed-in posture into something statuesque. She felt exposed, yet for the first time in her life, she felt armored. Tae-Kyung stood by the window, the dragon on his neck pulsing as he turned to look at her. His eyes narrowed, traveling from her heels to the diamonds at her throat. The stillness in his expression shifted into something darker, a possessive hunger that made her pulse race against her will. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the marble, until he was invading her personal space. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the diamond pendant, his cold fingers lingering against the heat of her collarbone. The touch was a claim. "Diamonds are harder than steel," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips. "And just as cold. They tell the world that you belong to the dragon. They tell my enemies that to lay a finger on you is to invite a war they cannot survive." Naomi looked into his eyes, seeing the predator behind the gentleman. "Is this protection, or am I just a different kind of prize?" Tae-Kyung's hand moved from the necklace to her jaw, his thumb resting firmly against her racing pulse, mimicking the way he had studied her in the street. "It's both. In my world, Naomi, there is no such thing as a free walk home. You asked for a lion to guard you. This is the price." He stepped back, but the weight of his gaze remained. She was no longer a servant hiding in the shadows of a hotel hallway. She was a marked woman, draped in the wealth of a monster. The silk felt like a second skin, and the diamonds felt like a collar, but as she looked at her reflection, she saw a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. She was becoming a part of it. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, but even the strongest walls have cracks, and those cracks are almost always human. Jin-ho, Tae-Kyung's right-hand man, and the shadow that had stood at his shoulder for a decade, watched from the doorway of the monitoring room. His eyes weren't on the thermal perimeter scans or the encrypted comms. They were fixed on the reflection in the glass. Naomi was sitting at the edge of the sprawling mahogany table, her silk dress shimmering like oil on water. She was laughing softly at something Tae-Kyung had said, a sound that didn't belong in a house built on silence and bone. To Jin-ho, that laugh was the sound of an empire crumbling. He had watched Tae-Kyung dismantle the Iron Fang with surgical coldness for years, but in the last 48 hours, the dragon had grown soft. He was distracted. He was spending time choosing silk and diamonds instead of choosing targets. He was protecting a maid when he should have been purging the city. The distraction had to be removed. Jin-ho reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone. His thumbs moved with practiced, treasonous speed. He didn't want Tae-Kyung dead. He wanted him back. He wanted the monster he had sworn to follow, not this man who studied a woman's pulse with more interest than a ledger. By leaking their location to the Iron Fang, Jin-ho wasn't just inviting an attack, he was setting a stage. He believed that when the bullets started flying, Tae-Kyung would realize the girl was a liability. He would see her as the anchor dragging him into the depths, and he would cut the line. "The dragon's nest is open. 3 a.m., the service entrance," the message read. He hit send. The betrayal felt like a cold weight in his chest, but he justified it as loyalty. Back in the main hall, the air was still thick with a deceptive peace. Tae-Kyung was pouring a drink, his movements fluid, his eyes never straying far from Naomi. He didn't notice the subtle shift in Jin-ho's posture when he re-entered the room. He didn't notice the way the security lights on the console flickered for a fraction of a second as the external sensors were bypassed. "The perimeter is secure, boss," Jin-ho lied, his voice as steady as the blade he carried. Tae-Kyung nodded, his hand coming to rest on the back of Naomi's chair. His fingers brushed the silk of her shoulder, a gesture of quiet, terrifying intimacy. "Good. We move at dawn. I want the Iron Fang leaders neutralized before they can regroup." "Understood," Jin-ho replied, bowing low. As he backed out of the room, he caught Naomi's gaze. She looked at him with that same controlled panic, her hyper-vigilance picking up on a vibration in the air that Tae-Kyung, blinded by his own obsession, had missed. She saw the hardness in Jin-ho's eyes, the look of a man who had already decided she was a ghost. The silence of the penthouse began to hum with a new, jagged electricity. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of blacked-out vans pulling into the shadows of the basement. The stage was set. The dragon's right hand had opened the door, and the monsters Naomi had tried so hard to escape were no longer outside. They were already in the house. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, where the siege begins and Naomi has to save a wounded Tae-Kyung? The piece of the penthouse didn't break with a shout. It shattered with the rhythmic, muffled thump of tear gas canisters hitting the marble floor. Within seconds, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glass Naomi had once thought was a shield, vibrated as shadows descended from the roof on repelling lines. "Get down!" Tae-Kyung's voice roared through the burgeoning white fog. He lunged for Naomi, his hand catching her waist and throwing her behind the reinforced mahogany desk, just as a hail of gunfire chewed through the air where they had been standing. The sound was deafening, and a relentless mechanical tearing that turned the luxury suite into a slaughterhouse of shredded silk and pulverized stone. Tae-Kyung leaned out, his own weapon barking back with a rhythmic, lethal precision, but a sudden grunt of pain escaped him. Naomi watched in horror as a bloom of crimson stained the shoulder of his cream-colored shirt. "Tae-Kyung!" she screamed, the controlled panic that had defined her life finally reaching a breaking point. "I'm fine," he hissed, though his face was a mask of strained agony. He tried to reload, but his left arm hung uselessly at his side. The Iron Fang assassins were moving in, their tactical boots heavy on the marble. Jin-ho was nowhere to be seen. Naomi's mind raced. She looked at the blood on his shirt, then at the layout of the room. She had spent hours cleaning buildings just like this one, not the grand hallways, but the hidden arteries that kept them running. She remembered the service panel she had noticed while polishing the baseboards earlier that evening. "The floor," she whispered, grabbing Tae-Kyung's good arm. "The maintenance crawl space. It runs under the entire penthouse for the climate control wiring. It leads to the reinforced sublevel, your armory." Tae-Kyung looked at her, his eyes narrowed in a mix of pain and disbelief. "It's too small for me." "It's the only way," she urged, her voice steady with a desperate resolve. "They're watching the doors and the elevators. They don't know about the silent floor." She kicked aside a heavy decorative rug and used her fingernails to pry at the edge of a disguised floor plate. With a heave, she pulled it back, revealing a narrow, dark shaft. Tae-Kyung didn't hesitate. He slid into the darkness, Naomi following immediately behind him as she pulled the plate back into place just as the first grenade detonated in the room above. The space was cramped, smelling of dust and cold copper, but Naomi moved through it with a confidence born of years in the service tunnels of Seoul. She guided him through the labyrinth of wires and pipes, her hand locked onto his as she felt his strength flagging. The heat of his blood soaked through her silk dress, but she didn't stop. "Almost there," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. They reached a heavy steel hatch. Naomi entered the override code she had seen Jin-ho use earlier, her hypervigilance finally serving as her greatest weapon. The hatch hissed open. and they tumbled onto the cold floor of a windowless concrete room. The armory, rows of high-caliber rifles, tactical vests, and black market ordnance lined the walls. Tae-Kyung slumped against a rack of weapons, his breathing ragged. He looked up at Naomi, who stood in the center of the room, her midnight blue silk dress torn and stained with his blood, her eyes no longer wide with terror, but sharp with a predatory focus. "You saved me," he rasped, a dark, prideful smile touching his lips. Naomi didn't answer. She reached for a tactical medical kit and a submachine gun. The maid was gone. The queen was waking up. The smoke from the final confrontation still curled toward the high ceilings of the obsidian tower, but the air had already begun to cool. The Iron Fang assassins were gone, their bodies cleared by a cleanup crew that moved with the same silent efficiency Naomi once used to mop hotel floors. In the center of the armory, Jin-ho knelt on the concrete, his head bowed and his hands bound. He didn't look like a high-ranking lieutenant anymore. He looked like a man waiting for the blade to fall. Tae-Kyung stood before him, his wounded shoulder freshly bandaged under a clean black silk shirt. He didn't look at his traitorous right hand. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Naomi. She stood by the weapons rack, the torn midnight blue silk of her dress stained with grease and blood. She was no longer the trembling girl who had grabbed a stranger's arm in a rain-slicked alley. The controlled panic that had governed her life for years had finally hardened into something sharp and unbreakable. She held his gaze with a steady, unblinking focus that made even the seasoned guards in the room shift uncomfortably. "He thought you were a weakness," Tae-Kyung said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the room. He stepped toward her, ignoring the man begging for mercy at his feet. "He thought the maid was an anchor that would drown the dragon. He didn't realize that you were the only one who knew how to navigate the dark." Tae-Kyung reached out, his hand settling on the back of Naomi's neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying, reverent tenderness. In a move that stunned every soldier in the room, the most feared man in Seoul, the man who never lowered his head, slowly inclined his brow until it rested against hers. It was a silent, absolute surrender. "You are not a guest in this house." "Naomi," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips, "and you will never be a servant again. This city belongs to the dragon, and the dragon belongs to you." He turned back to the room, his hand still locked onto Naomi's, his fingers interlaced with hers. The diamonds at her throat caught the light, flashing like predatory eyes. "Purge the rest," Tae-Kyung commanded, his voice turning back to ice. "Every Iron Fang hideout, every traitor in our ranks. Let them know that the new order has arrived." As the guards moved to execute the final orders, Tae-Kyung led Naomi toward the elevator. They ascended back to the penthouse, stepping out onto the balcony that overlooked the sprawling, neon-lit heart of Seoul. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glittering like a spilled box of jewels. Naomi looked out over the skyline, the same streets where she had once walked in fear, hoping to remain invisible. She wasn't invisible anymore. Tae-Kyung stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they surveyed their kingdom. The girl in the green apron was a ghost. In her place stood a woman who had looked into the eyes of a monster and realized she was his only match. Outside, the world still turned on violence and power, but here, on the highest floor of the city, there was a new kind of peace. Naomi Brooks was no longer running from the shadows. She was the one who commanded them,